The coffee cup trembled against the marble table as Marcus Hartwell's fingers froze mid-reach. Across the bustling café, between the symphony of clinking silverware and muffled conversations, his eyes locked onto something that made his chest tighten with recognition he couldn't yet name. There, at a corner table barely visible through the afternoon crowd, sat a woman whose fingers danced across raised dots on yellowed paper with the same graceful precision he remembered from 25 years ago. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Metropolitan Bistro, Manhattan's newest culinary darling, where Marcus had come to close another multi-million-dollar deal. But the leather portfolio containing contracts worth more than most people's homes lay forgotten as he watched the woman's weathered hands move across the Braille text with an intimacy that spoke of decades spent reading through touch. Her silver hair, pulled back in a simple bun, caught the amber light from the vintage Edison bulbs overhead, and something in the careful way she held her head, listening to the world around her, sent a shiver of memory down his spine. "Mr. Hartwell?" The voice of his business partner, Jonathan Chen, seemed to come from underwater. "The Riverside development contracts need your signature before 5 o'clock." Marcus barely heard him. The woman had paused in her reading, her head tilted slightly as if she'd sensed his stare. Even from 30 feet away, he could see the familiar pattern of concentration that creased her brow, the same expression she'd worn when helping him navigate the darkness of his childhood bedroom after the accident that had stolen his sight for 3 terrible years. The cafe's atmosphere buzzed with the energy of success. Venture capitalists in tailored suits discussing venture valuations, fashion executives planning next season's campaigns, and tech entrepreneurs sketching revolutionary ideas on napkins. This was Marcus's world now, a kingdom built from the ashes of a childhood spent struggling to see beyond the shadows that had once defined his existence. Yet none of it mattered as he studied the woman's profile, searching for confirmation of something his heart already knew. She wore a simple black dress beneath a worn cardigan that had seen better decades, her only jewelry a thin gold chain that disappeared beneath her collar. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance by the standards of this upscale establishment, nothing that would typically draw the attention of the powerful people who paid $200 for lunch here. But Marcus saw beyond the surface, beyond the obvious markers of social status that his world valued so obsessively. The waitress serving her table was new, Marcus could tell by her nervous energy and the way she fumbled with the ordering tablet. She approached the woman with visible uncertainty, probably unsure how to communicate with someone who couldn't see the tablet's screen or the daily specials written on the chalkboard behind the bar. Marcus watched the woman smile, that same patient, encouraging smile that once convinced a frightened 8-year-old boy that losing his sight wasn't the end of his world, and gently explained that she preferred to hear the options rather than see them written down. "She's just ordering soup," muttered Jonathan, following Marcus's gaze with obvious impatience. "Can we please focus on the contracts? The city planning committee meets tomorrow morning, and if we don't get these signatures filed today, we lose the development window." But Marcus couldn't look away. The woman's hands had returned to her Braille book, and he found himself remembering the way those same fingers had once guided his own across raised letters, teaching him that words could exist in dimensions beyond sight. She'd been young then, probably in her early 30s, fresh out of graduate school with a master's degree in special education and dreams of changing the world one student at a time. Now she appeared to be in her late 50s or early 60s, and the dreams had clearly taken a different shape. The reality of seeing her here, in this particular place, at this particular moment, felt like the universe playing some cosmic joke. Here he was, surrounded by the trappings of extraordinary success, a net worth that put him on Forbes lists, real estate developments that reshaped city skylines, a reputation that opened doors from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. And there she was, reading alone in a corner, wearing clothes that suggested a life lived far from the abundance that now defined his existence. 25 years ago, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman had been the lighthouse in his storm, the voice that guided him through the darkest period of his childhood when a rare eye infection had stolen his vision and threatened to steal his future along with it. She had arrived at his family's Connecticut estate like an answer to desperate prayers, hired by his parents to teach him Braille and help him navigate a world suddenly made of sounds and textures rather than colors and shapes. Marcus remembered their first meeting with painful clarity. He'd been hiding in his bedroom closet, refusing to come out, refusing to accept that the blurry shadows at the edges of his vision were all he might ever see again. His parents had tried everything. Specialists from Johns Hopkins, experimental treatments in Switzerland, even faith healers whose promises felt more like cruel jokes than hope. But Mrs. Eleanor Whitman had done something different. She'd sat on the floor outside his closet and begun reading aloud from the secret garden, her voice painting pictures more vivid than his eyes had ever shown him. "I don't believe you're going to remain blind forever," she'd said during one of their early sessions, her hands covering his as they traced letters together on the Braille practice board. "But even if you do, that doesn't mean your life becomes smaller. It just means you learn to see with different parts of yourself." She'd been right, eventually. After 2 years of intensive treatment and 3 surgeries, his vision had returned gradually, like dawn breaking over water. But the lessons she'd taught him about resilience, about finding light in darkness, about the power of words to create worlds, had stayed with him long after he could see again. Those lessons had driven him through Harvard Business School, through the lean years of building his first company, through the nights when success seemed impossible and failure felt inevitable. And now, here she was, alone in a crowded café, reading with the same focused intensity he remembered from their sessions in the library of his childhood home. The book in her hands looked old, its Braille text probably pressed decades ago when such books were still produced in small print runs by specialized publishers. He wondered what she was reading, poetry, perhaps, or one of the classic novels she'd loved to discuss during their afternoon breaks from formal lessons. The waitress returned with a bowl of soup and a small basket of bread, setting them down with exaggerated care, as if afraid the blind woman might somehow be fragile because of her disability. Mrs. Whitman, if it was really her, accepted the service with the same grace he remembered, thanking the young woman warmly and asking about her day, in a way that made the waitress's nervous tension visibly ease. Marcus felt Jonathan's hand on his shoulder, pulling him back to the present moment. "Seriously, man, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Perhaps he had. The woman who had saved his childhood was sitting 30 feet away, and he had no idea how she'd ended up here, no understanding of the journey that had brought her to this moment. The last time he'd seen her was at his high school graduation party, when his parents had invited her to celebrate his acceptance to Harvard. She looked proud but also sad, as if she knew that his success meant their paths would diverge forever. He'd tried to find her over the years, especially after his first company went public, and he had the resources to track down the people who'd shaped his early life. But Eleanor Whitman had seemingly vanished from the educational system. Her teaching certificate expired, her last known address leading to an apartment building that had been demolished years earlier. His private investigators had come up empty, and eventually he'd accepted that some chapters of life remained forever closed. But here she was, reading Braille in a Manhattan cafe, wearing the same focused expression he remembered from countless afternoons spent learning that blindness was not a limitation, but simply a different way of experiencing the world. The sight of her stirred emotions he'd buried beneath decades of business deals and board meetings. Gratitude, so deep it felt like drowning, regret that he'd never properly thanked her, and something else he couldn't quite name. The rain outside grew heavier, turning the windows into rivers of distortion that made the cafe feel like a snow globe someone had just shaken. The other patrons continued their important conversations about mergers and acquisitions, about art gallery openings and charity galas, about all the glittering concerns that occupied Manhattan's elite. But Marcus felt removed from all of it, transported back to a time when the most important thing in his world was learning to spell his own name with his fingertips. Mrs. Whitman finished her soup with the same methodical care she'd once brought to teaching him proper Braille technique. She folded her napkin precisely, gathered her book and the worn leather purse that sat beside her chair, and began to rise from the table.
Marcus realized with sudden panic that she was about to leave, that this impossible moment was about to slip away like so many other chances he'd failed to take in his life. "I have to go," he said to Jonathan, pushing back from the table so quickly that his chair scraped against the polished concrete floor. "What? Marcus, the contracts!" But Marcus was already moving, weaving between tables full of New York's power players, his heart hammering with a mixture of anticipation and terror. What would he say to her? How could he possibly explain the impact she had on his life, the way her patient teaching had given him not just the ability to read in darkness, but the confidence to build an empire in the light? She was moving toward the door with the careful but confident steps of someone who had long ago learned to navigate the world without sight. Her hand trailed lightly along the backs of chairs, using them as guideposts, while maintaining the dignity and independence that had always defined her approach to blindness. Watching her move through the crowded restaurant, Marcus was struck by how little the fundamental essence of her had changed. She was still the woman who had refused to let his disability become a prison. The cafe's front door was heavy glass and brass, designed more for aesthetic impact than practical use. Marcus watched Mrs. Whitman approach it and realized she might struggle with its weight, especially while carrying her book and purse and navigating the uneven threshold that led to the rain-soaked sidewalk beyond. This was his moment, his chance to reconnect with the person who had shaped his understanding of perseverance. He quickened his pace, dodging a server carrying a tray of espresso drinks, sidestepping a table where two women were engaged in animated discussion about gallery representation. The distance between them felt vast, despite being only a few yards, as if he were traversing not just physical space, but decades of accumulated experience and missed opportunities. Mrs. Whitman reached the door and paused, her hand on the brass handle. For a moment Marcus wondered if she'd changed her mind about leaving, if perhaps the rain had convinced her to wait for clearer skies.
Weather. But then she turned slightly, as if sensing something, and her face came into fuller view. Even with the passage of 25 years, even with the lines that time had etched around her eyes and the silver that had replaced her once brown hair, he knew with absolute certainty that this was Eleanor Whitman, the woman who had taught him that darkness was not the end of seeing, but the beginning of understanding. "Mrs. Whitman?" The words escaped his lips before he could stop them, spoken just loudly enough to carry over the cafe's ambient noise, but not so loud as to startle her. She froze, her hands still on the door handle, her head tilted in that familiar listening pose that meant she was processing not just the words that had spoken them, but the voice that had spoken them. For a long moment, neither of them moved, and Marcus wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake, if approaching her like this was somehow an invasion of privacy or a disruption of whatever life she'd built in the years since they'd last spoken. Then, slowly, she turned toward him, and the smile that spread across her face was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It was the same smile that had greeted him every morning when he'd reluctantly made his way to their lessons, the same expression of patient joy that had convinced him learning could be an adventure rather than a chore. "Marcus?" Her voice carried the same warmth he remembered, though it was softer now, worn smooth by years of speaking to students and colleagues and strangers. "Marcus Hartwell?" The sound of his name spoken in her voice transported him instantly back to childhood, to afternoons spent in his family's library, learning that books could be read with fingers as well as eyes, that words had texture and weight and presence beyond their visual appearance. He felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes and realized that seeing her again was unleashing emotions he'd kept locked away for decades. But questions swirled in his mind like the rain swirling outside the cafe windows. How had Eleanor Whitman, who once was one of Connecticut's most respected special education teachers, ended up alone in a Manhattan restaurant, reading worn Braille books and ordering soup? What story lay hidden in the 25 years between the proud woman at his graduation party and the solitary figure he'd just watched navigate the world with quiet dignity? As they stood there looking at each other across the years, Marcus realized that this moment was both an ending and a beginning. both an answer to questions he'd carried since childhood and the start of new questions he'd never thought to ask. The rain continued to fall against the windows, and the cafe continued to buzz with the conversations of people who had no idea they were witnessing a reunion that had been 25 years in the making. The recognition hung between them like a bridge spanning decades, fragile and impossibly precious. Marcus watched Eleanor's face cycle through emotions, surprise melting into joy, joy shadowed by something that looked like embarrassment, embarrassment giving way to the same gentle composure that had anchored all their interactions when he was a child. "My goodness," she whispered, her free hand moving unconsciously to smooth her silver hair. "Marcus Hartwell! I can't believe—" She paused, and I saw her processing the reality of where they were, what they were both doing in this expensive Manhattan restaurant on a rainy Thursday afternoon. "You're so tall. I suppose that's foolish to say. You were 12 when I last saw you. Of course you'd be tall now." Her voice carried the same musical quality he remembered, but there was something different in it now, a careful modulation that suggested years of choosing words precisely, of presenting herself in ways designed to make others comfortable. It was the voice of someone who had learned to navigate not just physical obstacles, but social ones. The delicate balance of maintaining dignity while accepting help, of being visible without being a burden. He felt the weight of the moment, the impossible convergence that had brought them together in this place. Behind him, he could sense Jonathan's growing impatience, could practically feel the unsigned contracts burning holes in the leather portfolio on their table. But none of that mattered now. 25 years of success, the Harvard MBA, the real estate empire, the recognition that came with being listed among the city's top entrepreneurs suddenly felt secondary to this connection with the person who had taught him that setbacks were not endings, but redirections. "Would you—" He gestured toward the cafe, realized she couldn't see the gesture, then corrected himself. "Would you like to sit back down? Maybe have coffee? I was just finishing a meeting, but I'd love to catch up." Eleanor's smile flickered, and Marcus caught a glimpse of something that made his chest tighten, a moment of hesitation that suggested she was calculating the cost of staying versus the safety of leaving. It was an expression he'd never seen on her face during their lessons, when she had always seemed supremely confident and in control of every situation. "I don't want to interrupt your business," she said carefully. "This looks like quite an important place for quite important meetings." The words stung because they revealed how aware she was of the gulf between his world and hers. The Metropolitan Bistro was exactly the kind of place where important meetings happened, where deals worth millions were discussed over appetizers that cost more than many people spent on groceries in a week. It was his natural habitat now, but seeing it through her eyes made him conscious of its ostentation in ways he usually ignored. "Please," he said, and the word came out more intensely than he'd intended. "Mrs. Whitman, I've thought about you so many times over the years. I tried to find you, to thank you properly for everything you did for me. This feels like—" He searched for words that could capture the magnitude of this coincidence, without sounding overdramatic. "This feels like the universe giving us both a gift." Eleanor's expression softened, and Marcus saw a flicker of the woman who had once convinced a stubborn, frightened child that learning Braille wasn't admitting defeat, but claiming power. She nodded slowly, allowing him to guide her back toward his table, where Jonathan sat surrounded by contracts and barely contained frustration. "Jonathan Chen," Marcus said as they approached, "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Eleanor Whitman. Eleanor, this is my business partner, Jonathan." Jonathan rose politely, but Marcus could see the questions in his eyes. Questions about why a lunch meeting about urban development had suddenly become a reunion with a woman who clearly existed in a different economic stratum than their usual associates. To his credit, Jonathan managed a genuine smile and offered Eleanor his chair, which put her back against the wall where she could hear the cafe's activity without being overwhelmed by it. "Mrs. Whitman was my teacher," Marcus explained as they settled into their seats. "A very special teacher during a very difficult time in my life." Eleanor accepted a menu from the hovering waitress, but set it aside without opening it. I imagine you have many teachers to thank. Harvard Business School, wasn't it? I remember your parents mentioning your acceptance during your graduation party. The fact that she remembered surprised him, though it shouldn't have. Eleanor had always paid attention to details, had always made each of her students feel like their progress and achievements mattered deeply to her. It was one of the qualities that had made her such an extraordinary teacher, the ability to hold space for other people's dreams, even when her own path was uncertain. Yes, Harvard, Marcus confirmed, and then Stanford for a semester abroad, studying international markets. But honestly, Mrs. Whitman, the most important education I ever received was in my family's library, learning to read Braille with you. He watched her process this statement, saw the way her hands stilled on the table, as if she was trying to hold on to something precious and fragile. When she looked up, there was moisture in her eyes that she quickly blinked away. That's very kind of you to say, Marcus. I remember those afternoons fondly. You were such a determined student, even when you were frustrated and scared. Jonathan cleared his throat softly, and Marcus realized he needed to address the practical reality of their abandoned business meeting. John, would it be possible to reschedule with the planning committee? I know it's complicated, but this is really important to me. The filing deadline can be met tomorrow morning if we work late tonight. Please, just give us an hour. Jonathan's expression moved through several stages of disbelief before settling into resigned acceptance. He gathered the contracts with movements that suggested Marcus would be hearing about this decision later in terms that would not be gentle. 1 hour, he said firmly. After that, we either sign these papers or we lose the development rights. After Jonathan left, the table felt both intimate and more charged. Marcus found himself studying Eleanor's face, noting the changes that 25 years had brought while searching for the woman who had shaped his understanding of resilience. Her skin bore the fine lines of someone who had smiled frequently but also squinted against worry, and her hands showed the calluses and careful movements of someone who read constantly through touch. "Tell me about your life," he said, then immediately realized how broad and potentially intrusive the request was. "I mean, I'd love to know what you've been doing, what brought you to New York." Eleanor's pause was long enough to be noticeable, and when she spoke, her words had the careful quality of someone who had learned to edit her story for different audiences. "I taught for several more years after we worked together, mostly in Connecticut, a few years in Massachusetts. Special education was changing so much, new technologies, different approaches to inclusion. I tried to keep up, but eventually decided it was time for younger teachers to take over." The explanation felt incomplete, like a summary that had been refined through multiple tellings to remove the complications and disappointments that probably defined the real story. Marcus sensed there was much more beneath the surface, years of struggle that had brought her from a comfortable teaching position to reading alone in expensive restaurants she probably couldn't afford. "And now?" he asked gently. "Now I live in Brooklyn. I have a small apartment near Prospect Park where I can walk easily and the subway is accessible. I do some volunteer work with literacy programs, help adults learn Braille if they've lost their vision later in life. It's rewarding work, though quite different from teaching children." She was being polite, Marcus realized, giving him the version of her life that would make him comfortable, rather than the truth that would make them both uncomfortable. He recognized the pattern from his own
interactions with people from his past, the careful editing that happened when success created distance between who you were and who you used to be. "Eleanor," he said, using her first name intentionally, hoping to bridge some of the formality that seemed to be growing between them. "I want you to know that what you taught me, it wasn't just Braille. You taught me that obstacles don't have to be limitations, that losing one thing doesn't mean losing everything. Those lessons built my entire career." She smiled, but it was tinged with something sad. "I'm glad the lessons were helpful, Though I have to admit, I'm curious about how learning Braille led to real estate development. Marcus laughed, surprised by her directness. It was the first moment that felt like their old dynamic, when she had never hesitated to ask the questions that pushed him to think more deeply about his assumptions and goals. "It's not as strange as it sounds," he said. "When I was learning to navigate without sight, you taught me to map spaces in my mind, to understand buildings and rooms through sound and movement and spatial relationships. You helped me realize that architecture isn't just visual, it's about how spaces feel, how they function, how they serve the people who use them." Eleanor's expression grew more interested, less guarded. "I remember those mapping exercises. You struggled with them initially." "I hated them," Marcus admitted, "but they changed how I think about space and design. When I started developing properties, I insisted on accessibility features that went far beyond legal requirements, buildings that work for people with different kinds of vision, different mobility needs, different ways of processing information." He pulled out his phone and began showing her photos of his developments, then realized she couldn't see them and felt a familiar flush of embarrassment. The same feeling he'd had as a child when he'd forgotten, momentarily, that she couldn't see the pictures in the books they read together. "Sorry, describe them to me," she said simply. "I'd love to hear about your work." So he did. He told her about the mixed-income housing complex in Queens that included tactile navigation systems throughout the common areas, about the office building in Brooklyn that had been designed with acoustic considerations for people who navigated primarily through sound. He described the shopping center in the Bronx, where every store entrance had been positioned and marked to be accessible to customers with visual impairments, and the apartment complex in Manhattan, where the elevators announced floor numbers in multiple languages and formats. As he talked, Eleanor's posture changed. The careful, polite distance she'd maintained began to dissolve, replaced with the engaged attention he remembered from their tutoring sessions. She asked questions about construction challenges, about community response, about how he'd convinced investors to support features that added cost without immediately obvious returns. "It sounds like you've built a career around the principle that good design serves everyone, that accessibility isn't accommodation, it's just good architecture." "Exactly. But Eleanor, I learned that principle from you, from the way you taught me that Braille wasn't a consolation prize for people who couldn't see regular print. It was just another way to access the same information." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth that reminded Marcus of the way she used to trace letters when she was thinking through a particularly challenging lesson plan. "Marcus," she said finally, "I need to tell you something. I haven't been entirely honest about my current situation." The words sent a chill through him, partly because of their content, but mostly because of the tone in which she spoke them. Careful and resigned, as if she was about to reveal something she'd been hoping to avoid. "You don't have to. I think I do." She straightened in her chair, and for a moment he saw the teacher she had been, the woman who had never shied away from difficult conversations if they served her students' growth. "I'm not just volunteering with literacy programs. I'm working as a waitress at a diner in Brooklyn. Have been for the past 8 years. The revelation hit Marcus like cold water. Eleanor Whitman, who had possessed one of the finest educational minds he'd ever encountered, who had taught him lessons that had shaped a multi-million-dollar career, was waiting tables to make ends meet. "The teaching position I had in Massachusetts ended when the district had budget cuts. Special education was expensive, and my salary was high because of my experience. I tried to find other positions, but the field was changing, and younger teachers with newer training were more attractive to districts trying to modernize their programs." "That's insane! Your knowledge, your skills, are valuable in specific contexts, but not necessarily marketable in the broader economy. I'm not bitter about it, Marcus. Teaching was my calling, not just my career. When that door closed, I found other ways to be useful."
She told him about the diner where she worked, a 24-hour establishment near the Brooklyn College campus, where she served coffee to students pulling all-nighters and breakfast to night shift workers heading home. The owner, Mrs. Kowalski, had hired her, despite her blindness, because she was reliable and kind, and because the regular customers had come to appreciate her ability to remember their orders and ask about their lives. "It's honest work," Eleanor said, but Marcus could hear the defensiveness in her voice, the way she was preparing for judgment or pity. "And it lets me keep my volunteer commitments. Some of the literacy students I work with have become like family to me." Marcus listened to her describe her current life, the small apartment where she lived alone, the careful budgeting required to make a waitress's wages cover rent and food and the occasional book, the simple pleasures of her morning walks through Prospect Park, and her evening sessions helping adults learn to read Braille for the first time. It was a life pared down to essentials, stripped of the comfortable middle-class security she'd once known, but rich in human connections and purposeful work. Marcus realized that Eleanor had been living the values she'd tried to teach him about finding meaning beyond material success, about measuring wealth in relationships and contributions rather than bank account balances. But it also made him furious, not at her choices, but at the waste of it all. Here was a woman who had shaped his understanding of education and accessibility, who possessed insights that could revolutionize how schools approached students with disabilities, and she was working for tips at a Brooklyn diner because the education system had decided her experience was obsolete. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is wrong. What you know, what you can do, there have to be opportunities. Consulting work, curriculum development, teacher training programs." She smiled sadly. "You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the education world has moved on. Most of the advocacy is done by younger people who understand technology better than I do, who speak the current language of inclusion and accessibility. I tried for years to find my place in the new landscape, but eventually I had to accept that my time had passed." The resignation in her voice broke something inside Marcus. This was the woman who had taught him never to accept limitations, never to let circumstances define his possibilities. Hearing her describe her own life with such defeat felt like watching his childhood hero crumble before his eyes. "Your time hasn't passed," he said fiercely. "Eleanor, what you taught me, about seeing beyond the obvious, about designing for different kinds of minds and bodies, that's more relevant now than ever. The world needs your perspective." Eleanor's expression grew wistful. "That's kind of you to say, Marcus, but kindness doesn't pay rent or buy groceries. I've made my peace with this life. It's smaller than I once imagined, but it's also real and meaningful in ways my teaching career sometimes wasn't." The waitress appeared to refill their coffee cups, and Marcus noticed how Eleanor thanked her with genuine warmth, asked about her classes at the community college, remembered that she'd been worried about her mother's surgery. Even here, in this chance encounter during her day off, Eleanor was still teaching, still modeling how to treat people with dignity and attention. Watching her interact with the young waitress, Marcus realized that Eleanor's gifts hadn't been diminished by her circumstances. She was still the same person who had changed his life, still possessed the same capacity for seeing potential in unexpected places and drawing out the best in the people around her. The only thing that had changed was society's ability to recognize and value what she had to offer. As the afternoon wore on and the rain continued to streak the cafe's windows, Marcus felt the weight of 2 decades of missed opportunities settling in his chest. He had built an empire while Eleanor had quietly struggled to survive, had accumulated wealth and influence while she had been forced to start over again and again. The injustice of it made him want to overturn tables and demand explanations from a universe that allowed such waste. But more than anger, he felt a growing sense of purpose. This reconnection wasn't just a chance encounter, it was an opportunity to address an injustice, to use the success that had grown from her teachings to create space for her gifts to flourish again. The question was whether she would let him try,
and whether 25 years of missed connections could be bridged by good intentions and abundant resources. The rain had softened to a gentle percussion against the cafe's windows when Marcus's phone began buzzing with increasing urgency. Jonathan's name flashed on the screen 3 times before Marcus finally answered, his voice tight with irritation at the interruption.
"The planning committee moved the deadline up," Jonathan said without preamble. "They want the filings by 4 o'clock today, not tomorrow morning. If we don't get these contracts signed and submitted in the next 2 hours, we lose the Riverside project." Marcus glanced at his watch. 2:30 p.m. The Riverside development was an 18-month project worth $47 million, the kind of deal that could fund a dozen smaller ventures and establish his firm as a major player in Manhattan's competitive development market. 2 hours ago, it had been the most important thing in his world. Now, looking across the table at Eleanor as she carefully folded her napkin and prepared to excuse herself from what she clearly perceived as an important business crisis, the project felt like an elaborate distraction from something infinitely more significant. "Give me 15 minutes, Marcus told Jonathan. "I'll be right there." But as he ended the call, Eleanor was already gathering her worn leather purse and the Braille book that had first caught his attention. "I should let you handle your business," she said, with the same diplomatic grace that had characterized all their interactions since childhood. "This was lovely, Marcus. Truly, I'm so proud of what you've accomplished." The finality in her tone struck him like a physical blow. After 25 years of wondering about her life, of carrying gratitude he'd never been able to express, she was preparing to disappear again into the vast anonymity of New York City. The thought of losing her a second time, of reducing this reunion to a pleasant but brief encounter that would fade into memory, filled him with desperate urgency. "Wait," he said, reaching across the table to touch her hand gently. "Eleanor, please don't go. Not yet. I know I have this business emergency, but I can't just let you walk away again." She paused, her hand still under his, and he felt the slight tremor that suggested she was wrestling with something more complex than simple politeness. When she looked up, her expression carried a vulnerability he'd never seen during their teaching sessions, the look of someone who had learned to expect disappointment, but hadn't quite stopped hoping for something different. "Marcus, I appreciate the sentiment, but I understand how these things work. You have a life, a career, responsibilities that matter. I'm just someone from your past who happened to be in the right place at the right time to help you through a difficult period." The dismissive way she described her role in his childhood made his chest tighten with frustration. How could she not understand the magnitude of her impact? How could someone who had been so perceptive about his potential be so blind to her own significance? "That's not true," he said, his voice carrying an intensity that made several nearby diners glance in their direction. "Eleanor, you didn't just help me through a difficult period. You changed the entire trajectory of my life. You taught me that losing one ability doesn't mean losing all possibilities. Every building I've designed, every project I've completed, every success I've achieved, it all traces back to lessons you taught me when I was 12 years old." Eleanor's expression softened, but she maintained her posture of gentle withdrawal. "I'm glad those lessons were helpful. But Marcus, I'm not the same person who taught you Braille 25 years ago. That woman had dreams and ambitions and a place in the world. This version of me, the one sitting across from you right now, is just trying to get by with dignity intact." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 2 men in expensive suits who approached their table with the confident assumption that their business took priority over any personal interaction. Marcus recognized them as representatives from the city planning office, the kind of bureaucrats who wielded enormous power over development projects through their control of permits and regulatory approvals. "Mr. Hartwell," the taller of the 2 men, Marcus remembered his name as Patterson or Pearson, something generically official, smiled with practiced insincerity. "Sorry to interrupt, but we need to discuss the Riverside timeline. There have been some concerns raised about your accessibility proposals." The irony of the timing was so sharp that it felt like satire.
Here he was, sitting across from the woman who had taught him to think about accessibility as a fundamental design principle, being told that those very considerations might jeopardize his largest project to date. "What kind of concerns?" Marcus asked, though he could guess the answer. He'd encountered this resistance before, city officials and investors who viewed accessibility features as expensive complications rather than necessary improvements. Patterson, Marcus now remembered his name correctly, pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed analysis of the Riverside project specifications. "The tactile navigation systems you've proposed for the common areas will add approximately $2.3 million to the construction budget. The acoustic design modifications for the residential units add another $1.8 million. The planning committee is questioning whether these expenditures serve the broader public interest."
Eleanor had gone very still across the table, her attention focused on the conversation with an intensity that reminded Marcus of how she used to listen when he was struggling with a particularly difficult Braille passage. He could see her processing not just the words, but the implications, the casual way these men were discussing the value of accommodations that would determine whether people like her could fully participate in community life. "Those features don't just serve people with disabilities," Marcus replied, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger building in his chest. "They make the buildings more navigable for everyone. The tactile systems help people find their way in emergencies when visibility is compromised. The acoustic design reduces noise pollution and creates more comfortable living environments for all residents." The second official, a younger man whose aggressive posture suggested he was accustomed to winning arguments through persistence rather than logic, leaned forward with the expression of someone about to deliver a decisive blow. "Mr. Hartwell, we understand your commitment to these principles, but the reality is that the Riverside site could accommodate 40% more units if we eliminated the oversized common areas and reduced the individual unit square footage that your acoustic requirements demand. That's housing for 300 additional families." The argument was seductive in its simplicity. More housing meant helping more people. And in a city where affordable apartments were scarce, any proposal that reduced the total number of available units would be difficult to defend. Marcus had heard variations of this logic throughout his career. The way economic pressure was used to strip away features that served the most vulnerable populations in favor of solutions that appeared to benefit larger numbers. Eleanor cleared her throat softly, and both officials turned toward her with the polite but dismissive attention typically reserved for elderly relatives who might have opinions about important matters they didn't fully understand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority Marcus remembered from their lessons. "I'm Eleanor Whitman, and I've spent most of my career working with people who depend on the kinds of accommodations you're discussing." Patterson's expression shifted to practiced concern, the look of a politician preparing to demonstrate his sensitivity to constituent needs. "Of course, Mrs. Whitman, we always value input from the disability community, though I should mention that this is really a technical discussion about construction costs and zoning efficiency." The condescension in his tone was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of dismissal that Eleanor had probably encountered countless times throughout her career. Marcus watched her absorb it with the same patient composure she'd always shown when faced with adults who underestimated her intelligence or expertise. "I understand the technical aspects," Eleanor replied calmly. "I've consulted on accessibility design for several school districts and helped develop guidelines for public building construction. What I'm curious about is how you've calculated the cost-benefit analysis for these features." The younger official's aggressive posture faltered slightly. "Well, it's fairly straightforward. The additional construction costs are approximately $4 million. The building will serve roughly 1,200 residents over its projected lifespan. That's an additional cost of $3,300 per resident." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "And how many of those residents do you anticipate will have vision impairments,
hearing difficulties, mobility challenges, or other conditions that would make these accommodations necessary rather than merely convenient. The question hung in the air like a challenge neither official seemed prepared to answer. Marcus realized that Eleanor was doing what she'd always done best, forcing people to think more deeply about their assumptions by asking questions that revealed the limitations of their analysis. "Those are interesting points," the younger official conceded reluctantly. "But the fundamental issue remains that more units means more available housing, which serves a larger public good." Eleanor smiled, and Marcus recognized the expression that had preceded some of her most effective teaching moments. "That's true, if you assume all housing serves equally well. But if the additional units you create are less functional for a significant portion of the population, then you're not actually increasing
Housing availability? You're creating a two-tiered system where some housing works for everyone and other housing works only for people without disabilities." The conversation was drawing attention from other tables in the café, where Marcus could see other business discussions pausing as people tuned in to what was clearly becoming a debate about fundamental questions of urban planning and social equity. He found himself caught between admiration for Eleanor's ability to articulate these principles and anxiety about what this confrontation might mean for his project. Patterson was checking his watch with obvious impatience. "Mrs. Whitman, we appreciate your perspective, but we have deadline pressures that require immediate decisions. Mr. Hartwell, the planning committee needs your revised proposals by 4 o'clock if you want to maintain your development rights." The ultimatum was delivered with the casual brutality that characterized much of New York's development politics. Accept compromises that undermined your principles or lose the opportunity to build anything at all. Marcus had navigated these negotiations dozens of times before, had learned to accept partial victories and incremental progress as the price of participating in a system that prioritized speed and profit over more complex considerations. But sitting across from Eleanor, watching her calmly dismantle arguments that treated accessibility as an expensive luxury rather than a basic requirement, Marcus felt something shifting in his understanding of what compromise meant and what principles were worth protecting. "What if I refuse to revise the proposals?" he asked quietly. Both officials stared at him as if he'd suggested something not just impractical, but incomprehensible. In their world, developers didn't walk away from $47 million projects over accessibility features that served relatively small populations. "Then you lose the development rights," Patterson said bluntly. "And they'll likely go to someone more willing to work within realistic budget constraints." Marcus looked at Eleanor, who was watching the interaction with an expression that reminded him of their early lessons when she was trying to gauge whether he was ready to tackle more challenging material. He realized this moment was itself a kind of test, not of his business acumen or his ability to navigate political pressure, but of whether the values she'd taught him would hold up when they came into conflict with immediate self-interest. "Mrs. Whitman," the younger official said, turning to Eleanor with renewed attention, "perhaps you could help Mr. Hartwell understand the broader context here. New York needs housing more than it needs perfect accessibility. Surely some accommodation is better than no housing at all." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth that Marcus recognized as her thinking gesture. When she spoke, her voice carried the same gentle firmness she'd used when correcting his Braille technique without discouraging his efforts. "Young man, I've spent my entire career hearing arguments about why perfect shouldn't be the enemy of good, why partial solutions are better than no solutions. And there's truth in that perspective. But I've also seen what happens when we consistently accept some accommodation as sufficient. We end up with buildings that sort of work for people with disabilities, transportation that kind of serves their needs, education that somewhat includes them. She paused, and I could see her gathering the force of decades of experience into what felt like a crucial argument. The problem with that approach is that it treats accessibility as a favor society grants to people with disabilities rather than a fundamental aspect of good design. When you build with accessibility as an afterthought, you create environments that remind people every day that they weren't considered in the original planning. When you build with accessibility as a foundation, you create spaces that work better for everyone. The officials exchanged glances that suggested they were recognizing Eleanor as more formidable an opponent than they'd initially assumed. Marcus realized that this conversation had evolved beyond a simple discussion of construction costs into something resembling a philosophical debate about the kind of society they wanted to build. "Ma'am, with respect," Patterson's tone suggested the respect was quite limited. "We're talking about practical realities. Mr. Hartwell's proposal, as designed, will be more expensive than comparable projects, which means the rents will be higher, which means fewer people will be able to afford to live there. How does that serve the greater good?" Eleanor leaned forward slightly, and Marcus saw a flash of the passionate advocate who had fought for resources and understanding throughout her teaching career. She said, "That's exactly the wrong question. The right question is, why are we designing a system where accessibility and affordability have to compete with each other instead of supporting each other?"
She looked directly at Marcus as she continued, and he felt the weight of everything she'd taught him about seeing beyond immediate obstacles to longer-term possibilities. If accessible design is more expensive, it's because we've structured the construction industry to treat it as a specialty rather than a standard. If housing that serves everyone costs more than housing that serves only some people, it's because we've accepted a market that doesn't account for the real costs of exclusion. The conversation was interrupted by Jonathan's arrival, his face flushed with urgency and barely contained panic. "Marcus, we have 45 minutes to get to City Hall with signed contracts. The Riverside team is already there with alternative proposals that strip out most of the accessibility features. If we don't show up with our signatures, they're moving forward with their version." The weight of the moment settled over the table like a storm cloud. Marcus could see Jonathan's desperation, could practically feel the millions of dollars hanging in the balance of his next decision. Across from him, Eleanor was gathering her belongings again, clearly preparing to remove herself from a situation that had grown far beyond a chance encounter between former teacher and student. "Eleanor, please don't go," Marcus said, the words coming out more like a plea than a request. "I need you to help me think through this." She paused, her hand on her purse strap, and for a moment he saw her wrestling with conflicting impulses, the desire to help warring with the wisdom of staying clear of complications that could only end in disappointment. "Marcus," she said gently, "this isn't my decision to make. You've built a successful business by knowing how to navigate these kinds of choices. I'm just a retired teacher who doesn't understand the pressures you're facing." But even as she spoke the words, Marcus could see she didn't entirely believe them. The woman who had dismantled the officials' arguments with surgical precision was far from powerless, and the principles she'd articulated were exactly the guidance he needed to find his way through this crisis. The cafe around them had grown quieter, as if the other patrons sensed they were witnessing something significant, a moment where abstract principles would either prove their worth against practical pressures or crumble under the weight of economic reality. Marcus felt the eyes of everyone at the table fixed on him, waiting to see whether he would choose the safe path that preserved his business interests or the uncertain path that honored the values Eleanor had spent 25 years trying to teach him.
Outside, the rain had stopped, and late afternoon sunlight was beginning to stream through the cafe windows, casting everything in golden light that made the moment feel suspended between past and future, between the man he had become and the person he still had the potential to be. The golden light streaming through the cafe windows illuminated Eleanor's face as she waited for Marcus's decision. And in that moment, he saw not just the woman who had taught him Braille, but the person whose entire career had been built on believing that every individual deserved to navigate the world with dignity and independence. The weight of that recognition settled in his chest like a physical presence, making it difficult to breathe. "Jonathan," Marcus said slowly, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised even him. "Call the planning committee and tell them we're withdrawing our proposal." The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan's face cycled through disbelief, panic, and something approaching fury before settling into the rigid control of someone trying not to explode in public. The city officials stared at Marcus as if he'd announced his intention to give away his fortune to strangers on the street. "You can't be serious," Patterson said finally. "Mr. Hartwell, this is a $47 million project. You're talking about walking away from the largest development opportunity in Manhattan this year." Marcus felt Eleanor's attention focused on him with laser intensity, as if she was trying to understand not just what he was deciding, but why he was deciding it. The weight of her gaze reminded him of those long afternoons in his family's library, when she would wait patiently for him to work through a particularly challenging Braille passage, never giving him the answer, but somehow conveying absolute confidence that he would find it himself. "Jonathan," Marcus said slowly, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised even him, "I'm not walking away from the opportunity. I'm walking away from a version of the opportunity that compromises everything I believe about what good development should accomplish." Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but Marcus caught it. When he looked at her, he saw something in her expression that took him back to the moment when he'd successfully read his first complete sentence in Braille. A mixture of pride, surprise, and something that looked like hope. Jonathan's professional composure finally cracked. "Marcus, what the hell are you doing? This isn't just about the Riverside project. If you develop a reputation for walking away from deals over idealistic principles, no one in this city will work with you again." The threat was real and immediate. New York's development community was small and interconnected, and reputation was everything. A developer who couldn't be counted on to make practical compromises, when necessary, would find himself shut out of future opportunities, reduced to smaller projects with less ambitious goals. But as Marcus considered the implications of Jonathan's warning, he realized something had shifted in his understanding of what success meant and what risks were worth taking. For 25 years, he'd been building a career on foundations that Eleanor had helped him lay, but he'd never fully acknowledged the source of his strength or tested whether his principles could withstand real pressure. "Maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe working with people who prioritize profit over principle isn't the kind of success I want anymore." Eleanor was staring at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face, a combination of amazement and concern that suggested she was witnessing something both wonderful and potentially catastrophic. "Marcus," she said carefully, "I'm honored that our conversation has affected you this way, but please don't make decisions this significant based on one afternoon's discussion with someone whose own life hasn't exactly been a model of practical success." The self-deprecation in her voice made Marcus's chest tighten with frustrated affection. How could someone with such clear insight into human nature and social justice be so blind to her own worth and wisdom? "Eleanor, that's exactly why I trust your perspective. You've lived the consequences of these decisions. You've seen what happens when society chooses efficiency over inclusion, when institutions—" "You have something better than credentials," Marcus said firmly. "You have 30 years of experience translating between the disability community and the broader world.
You understand both the practical needs of people with different kinds of vision and mobility, and you know how to communicate those needs to people who've never had to think about them. Patterson was gathering his papers with movements that suggested he'd decided this conversation had moved beyond rational negotiation into territory he wasn't equipped to handle. Mr. Hartwell, you have 30 minutes to reconsider this decision. After that, the development rights transfer to the backup proposal. As the officials left, the café seemed to exhale, releasing tension that had been building since the confrontation began. Marcus found himself alone with Eleanor and Jonathan, surrounded by the debris of a decision that would reshape not just his business, but his understanding of what he wanted his life's work to accomplish. "You realize what you've just done?" Jonathan asked, his voice hollow with disbelief. "You've thrown away 2 years of planning and more money than most people see in a lifetime because a teacher from your childhood thinks accessibility features are important?" The dismissive way Jonathan characterized Eleanor made Marcus's anger flare hot and sudden. "How could teacher from your childhood taught me everything I know about seeing potential where others see problems? She showed me that limitations are often just failures of imagination. And she's just demonstrated more expertise about urban planning and social policy than those officials have probably acquired in their entire careers." Eleanor held up a hand, stopping Marcus before his defense of her could escalate further. "Jonathan has a point," she said calmly. "What you've just decided will have real consequences for your business, your relationships, your future opportunities. I don't want you to sacrifice your livelihood for abstract principles, especially not based on advice from someone whose own career ended in failure." The pain in her voice when she described her career as a failure made Marcus want to shake her until she understood how wrong that characterization was. Instead, he leaned forward and took her hands in his, feeling the calluses that decades of reading Braille had left on her fingertips. "Eleanor, your career didn't end in failure. It ended because the education system failed you. There's a difference." He looked directly into her eyes, willing her to see herself through his perspective. "Eleanor, what happened to you, losing your teaching position, struggling to find new opportunities, having to work as a waitress to survive, that's not a reflection of your value or your capabilities. It's a reflection of a society that doesn't know how to recognize and utilize the wisdom of people like you." Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful, as if she was considering a possibility she'd long ago dismissed as unrealistic. "Marcus, even if that's true, it doesn't change the practical reality of your situation. You've just walked away from a major project. What happens next?" Jonathan, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly straightened as if struck by inspiration. "Actually," he said slowly, "there might be something that could happen next. Something bigger than the Riverside project." Marcus and Eleanor both turned to look at him, surprised by the shift in his tone from despair to cautious excitement.
The federal infrastructure bill that passed last month includes $50 billion for accessible housing development, Jonathan continued, his voice gaining momentum as he worked through the implications. The grants are specifically designed to support projects that demonstrate innovative approaches to universal design. The application deadline is in 6 weeks. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Federal funding would mean freedom from the kind of compromises they'd just been asked to make, the ability to build according to principles rather than profit margins. But it would also mean competition with developers from across the country, all vying for grants that could revolutionize how accessible housing was conceived and constructed. "The grants are huge," Jonathan said, pulling out his phone to check the details. $10 to $50 million per project, with preference given to developments that include community education components and consultation with disability advocacy groups. Eleanor's intake of breath was sharp and sudden. Community education components? Training programs for construction workers, educational partnerships with local schools, consulting arrangements with people who have lived experience of disability? Jonathan was reading directly from the federal website now, his excitement building as he processed the possibilities. They want projects that don't just build accessible housing, but change how the construction industry thinks about accessibility. Marcus felt pieces clicking into place in his mind, a vision forming that was both more ambitious and more aligned with his values than anything he'd previously imagined. Eleanor, this is exactly what you've been describing. This is how we change the system instead of just accommodating it. But Eleanor was shaking her head, a familiar expression of caution shadowing her face. Marcus, I appreciate what you're thinking, but I'm not qualified for that kind of consulting work. I don't have current credentials, I don't understand modern construction techniques, and I certainly don't have experience with federal grant application processes. Eleanor, you're exactly what they want. Eleanor remained skeptical, but Marcus could see her processing the possibility, working through the implications the way she used to work through complex Braille texts with him. When she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes that she made no attempt to hide. Marcus, 25 years ago, I believed I was teaching you Braille, but what I was really teaching you was that losing something doesn't mean losing everything, that obstacles can become opportunities if you're willing to see them differently. Her voice was thick with emotion. I never imagined that someday you'd need to teach that same lesson back to me. Marcus felt his own eyes filling with tears as he recognized the significance of what she was saying. The student-teacher relationship that had defined their childhood connection was evolving into something more complex and mutual, a partnership based on shared values rather than expertise flowing in only one direction. Eleanor, I'm not teaching you anything you don't already know, he said gently. I'm just offering you a platform to use knowledge you've always possessed but haven't had the opportunity to apply. Jonathan cleared his throat diplomatically. I hate to interrupt this moment, but if we're serious about applying for federal funding, we need to move quickly. The application process is incredibly competitive, and we'll need to assemble a comprehensive proposal that demonstrates both innovation and feasibility. Eleanor straightened in her chair, and Marcus recognized the posture that had preceded some of their most productive tutoring sessions, the moment when she shifted from discussing a problem to solving it. If we're going to do this, she said, her voice carrying new authority, we need to do it right. The proposal can't just be about building accessible housing. It needs to be about changing how the construction industry understands accessibility. We need to demonstrate that universal design isn't more expensive when it's integrated from the beginning rather than added as an afterthought. Marcus felt excitement building in his chest as he watched Eleanor transform from reluctant participant to active leader. This was the woman who had revolutionized his understanding of education, now applying that same analytical precision to questions of urban development and social policy. We'll need community partnerships, Eleanor continued, her mind clearly racing through the requirements. Relationships with disability advocacy organizations, consultation agreements with people who can speak to different kinds of accessibility needs, educational components that train construction workers and architects to think differently about design. Jonathan was taking notes furiously, trying to capture Eleanor's vision before it outpaced his ability to document it. How long would it take to establish those kinds of relationships?
Eleanor smiled, and Marcus saw a glimpse of the confident professional she had been before circumstances forced her to rebuild her life from scratch. I've been volunteering with literacy organizations and disability advocacy groups for years. The relationships already exist. We just need to formalize them and expand them into new areas. As they talked through the practical requirements of assembling a grant proposal, Marcus realized that Eleanor's years of struggle hadn't been wasted time, but preparation for exactly this kind of opportunity. Her experience working with diverse communities, her understanding of both institutional barriers and grassroots advocacy, her ability to translate between different worlds of expertise, all of it positioned her perfectly for the kind of comprehensive approach the federal grants were designed to support. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as they sketched out the preliminary framework for a proposal that would dwarf the Riverside project in both scope and significance. Marcus felt the familiar thrill of a vision coming together. But this time, it was amplified by the knowledge that he was building something with the person who had first taught him to believe that vision was possible. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said as they prepared to leave the cafe.
If we're going to be partners in this work, there can't be any charity involved. I won't accept a position that's designed to help me rather than utilize my actual capabilities. Marcus understood immediately what she was saying. After years of receiving kindness that felt like pity, she needed this partnership to be based on mutual value rather than one-sided generosity. "Eleanor, I'm not offering you charity," he said firmly. "I'm offering you the chance to do work that matters, with resources adequate to the scope of the vision. If this grant comes through, you'll be transforming not just housing development, but the entire conversation about accessibility and inclusion." As they walked toward the cafe's exit, Marcus realized that the chance encounter that had begun with recognizing a familiar figure reading Braille had evolved into something that could reshape both their lives and potentially influence how American cities approached accessible design. The teacher who had once guided him through the darkness of temporary blindness was now helping him see possibilities he'd never imagined. And together, they were preparing to build something worthy of the lessons she'd spent her life trying to teach. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the construction trailer overlooking what would become the Whitman Hartwell Accessible Living Community, named not for its founders, but for the principle Eleanor had articulated that first afternoon in the cafe, that good design creates space for everyone to live with dignity. The federal grant had come through, $52 million to build not just housing, but a new model for how communities could be designed from the ground up with accessibility as a foundational element rather than an afterthought. Eleanor emerged from the trailer carrying architectural plans marked with Braille notations alongside standard measurements, her fingers moving across the raised dots as she verified dimensions with the same precision she'd once brought to teaching him letter formations. She wore a hard hat that looked slightly ridiculous over her silver hair and safety boots that had clearly never been designed with someone her age in mind, but her confidence was unmistakable. "The foundation pour for Building C looks good, but I want to double-check the tactile pathways before we install the permanent guidance systems. The spacing between the directional indicators feels slightly off." Marcus watched her consult the plans with expertise that had developed over months of intensive collaboration with architects, construction supervisors, and accessibility consultants from across the country. Eleanor had thrown herself into learning the technical aspects of universal design with the same methodical determination she'd once applied to teaching Braille, transforming herself into someone who could speak fluently about building codes and concrete specifications while never losing sight of the human experiences those details were meant to serve. Mrs. Chen from the Community Advocacy Group called this morning. She wants to bring another delegation of senior citizens through the model units. Apparently, word is spreading about the adjustable height features in the kitchens. The project had attracted attention far beyond New York's development community. Disability rights organizations, urban planning schools, and federal housing officials were treating the Whitman-Hartwell community as a test case for whether accessible design could both be economically viable and aesthetically appealing. Every detail was being scrutinized, from the way tactile navigation systems were integrated into landscaping to the acoustic engineering that made each unit feel both private and connected to the broader community. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Jonathan, who was meeting with representatives from 3 other cities interested in replicating their model. The business implications of their success were staggering. If the demonstration project proved economically sustainable, it could reshape how accessible housing was conceived and funded across the country. But watching Eleanor trace her fingers across building plans with the same focused attention she'd once brought to teaching him his first Braille sentence, Marcus realized the real measure of their success wasn't economic or even architectural. It was the transformation he'd witnessed in Eleanor herself over the past 6 months, the way she'd reclaimed not just professional purpose, but a sense of her own expertise and value. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, looking up from the plans with an expression Marcus had learned to recognize as the prelude to one of her more significant observations. "Yesterday, I got a call from the Department of Education. They want me to consult on new federal guidelines for accessible classroom design." Marcus felt pride swell in his chest, mixed with something that might have been vindication. The education system that had once discarded Eleanor as obsolete was now seeking her expertise for projects that could affect millions of students with disabilities. "That's incredible," he said. "Are you going to take it?" Eleanor smiled with the confidence of someone who had rediscovered her place in the world. "I'm going to take it, but on my terms. No more accepting positions designed to help me rather than utilize my capabilities. I'm consulting as an expert, not as a charity case." They walked together through the construction site, past workers installing tactile navigation strips that would guide residents with visual impairments while remaining nearly invisible to sighted users. The afternoon light caught the patterns in the pavement designs, accessibility features that had been integrated so seamlessly into the overall aesthetic that visitors often didn't realize they were experiencing universal design until someone pointed out the specific accommodations. "Marcus," Eleanor said, as they paused near the community center that would house educational programs and advocacy training, "do you remember what I told you 25 years ago about losing your sight not meaning losing your possibilities?" Marcus nodded, remembering the 8-year-old boy who had hidden in his closet, convinced that darkness meant the end of dreams. "I think I'm finally understanding what I was trying to teach you back then. It wasn't really about blindness at all. It was about the difference between letting circumstances define your limitations and choosing to define your own possibilities." As the sun set over the construction site, casting long shadows that would soon be illuminated by lighting systems designed to serve users with different kinds of vision, Marcus realized that their partnership had become something neither of them had originally envisioned. Eleanor had taught him that losing sight didn't mean losing vision, and together they had built something that proved the same principle applied to losing careers, losing certainty, losing the life you thought you were supposed to live. The Whitman Hartwell community would house 1,200 residents when completed, but its real impact would be measured in the conversations it started about what accessibility meant and why it mattered. Eleanor's expertise, once dismissed as obsolete, was now shaping federal policy and inspiring a new generation of designers to think differently about inclusion. Standing together in the growing darkness, surrounded by the evidence of what they had built from the ashes of circumstances that had once seemed like endings, Marcus understood that some reunions were less about reconnecting with the past than about discovering who you were meant to become. Eleanor had taught him to read in darkness 25 years ago, and now, together, they were teaching the world that the best kind of sight was the vision that saw possibility where others saw only problems. The construction lights flickered on, illuminating a future neither of them could have imagined when they'd first sat across from each other in a Manhattan café, recognizing something in each other that time had never quite erased. Tomorrow, they would continue building, not just housing, but hope, not just accessibility, but understanding, not just structures, but the kind of community that proved Eleanor had been right all along. Losing one thing never meant losing everything, as long as you were willing to see with different parts of yourself.